Today, we travel to the inside of a medieval castle. Not the grand version painted into old legends. Not the shining fortress standing proudly above green hills beneath clear skies. But the real place. The place people actually lived in, slept in, worked in, endured. And for most who passed through its heavy wooden gates, comfort was never part of the experience. Before we settle into tonight's journey, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if these slow walks through forgotten history have earned a small place in your evenings. And wherever you are tonight, whether it's raining outside your window or the room has already gone dark around you, let me know what time it is where you are listening from. There is something strangely comforting about knowing these stories drift softly through so many different nights around the world. Now, dim the lights a little if you can. Let the room grow quieter. Settle into your chair or beneath your blankets. And imagine, for just a moment, that the warmth around you is beginning to fade. Because tonight, we are leaving behind the romantic image of medieval castles and stepping instead into the cold stone reality of them. A place where smoke clung to the ceilings, where damp air settled into blankets and bones, where winter never truly left the walls, and where even silence could feel uncomfortable. At first glance, the castle appears impressive enough. You see it long before reaching it. Dark stone rising above the countryside, square towers standing against the evening sky, thin banners shifting weakly in the wind. From a distance, it almost feels reassuring, solid, protective, permanent. But the closer you move toward it, the less welcoming it becomes. The road leading upward is muddy from recent rain. The earth gives softly beneath boots and cartwheels. Cold mist hangs low across the fields, drifting slowly around grazing animals and abandoned fence posts. Nothing moves very quickly here. Even the wind seems tired. By the time you reach the outer gate, daylight has already begun slipping away. The guards above barely look down as travelers pass beneath the archway. Their faces are pale from cold exposure. Their hands stay buried inside rough wool sleeves whenever possible. Inside the walls, the air changes immediately. The smell reaches you first. Wet straw, smoke, animal waste, old wood soaked by years of rain. And beneath all of it, the faint scent of human bodies crowded too closely together for too long. It is not overwhelming at first, just constant. The kind of smell people eventually stop noticing because there is nowhere else to go. The courtyard itself feels smaller than expected. Stories often describe castles as vast and magnificent, but many were cramped places, built for defense before comfort, packed tightly with workshops, storage buildings, servants' quarters, horses, chickens, carts, barrels, and people moving constantly through narrow spaces. A blacksmith works beneath a wooden shelter near the wall. Each strike of the hammer echoes sharply against stone before disappearing into the evening fog. Nearby, a boy struggles to carry a bucket, half filled with water. His boots slip slightly in the mud. No one helps him. Further across the yard, two kitchen servants pull blankets from a line before rain begins again. The fabric already looks damp anyway. Nothing here feels warm. Not truly. Even activity seems exhausted. You follow the movement toward the great hall as darkness settles deeper across the castle grounds. Torchlight flickers weakly beside the entrance. Smoke curls upward into the damp evening air before quickly disappearing into fog. Inside, the hall is louder than outside, but somehow less comforting. Fire burns in a central hearth, though much of the heat escapes upward toward the rafters. The ceiling vanishes into shadow above drifting smoke. People lower in the room remain cold despite the flames. Long wooden tables stretch across the hall. Bowls of stew pass from hand to hand. Ale spills across rough surfaces stained by years of meals. And yet even here, with voices filling the room, something feels restrained. Nobody relaxes completely. A woman near the fire rubs warmth into her fingers while staring absently into the flames. A servant yawns quietly while carrying bread between tables. A guard removes one glove briefly to flex stiffened fingers before pulling it back on again. You begin noticing how much medieval life depended on enduring discomfort. Cold was everywhere. Smoke was everywhere. Noise never fully disappeared. Privacy barely existed. Even sleep was uncertain. Near the far side of the hall sits a man named Aldrich. Not a knight, not a lord, just one of many retainers responsible for helping maintain the castle grounds. He is somewhere past 40, though hard years make it difficult to tell exactly. His beard carries traces of gray. The skin around his eyes has roughened from wind and winter exposure. Tonight, he eats slowly beside the wall, shoulders wrapped beneath a heavy wool cloak that still appears damp from outside work. Across from him sits his younger nephew, Tomas. Tomas has only lived in the castle for 3 winters. Long enough to stop asking when things will improve. Not long enough to stop noticing the misery of it all. The cold reaches indoors faster every year, Tomas mutters quietly. Aldrich gives a faint smile at that. Not because it is funny, only familiar. The walls remember winter, he says. Then both men fall silent again. The fire crackles weakly nearby. Around them, conversations drift in fragments through the smoky air. Arguments about grain stores. Rumors of flooded roads farther south. A horse gone lame near the eastern gate. Ordinary concerns. But beneath them all sits something heavier. Fatigue. The castle wears people down slowly. Not through violence. Not through dramatic suffering. But through endless discomfort repeated day after day until exhaustion simply becomes normal. Later that night, servants begin preparing sleeping spaces inside side chambers branching away from the hall. Most people do not sleep alone. Privacy belongs mainly to nobility. And even they often have less of it than modern minds would imagine. For everyone else, sleeping means crowded rooms, shared warmth, shared noise, shared smells. The corridors leading deeper into the castle are colder than outside. Stone walls trap dampness easily. Water beads faintly across certain surfaces during winter nights. Drafts move invisibly through narrow passages despite attempts to seal them. Torchlight trembles along the walls as people pass. Some staircases spiral so tightly that carrying supplies becomes dangerous. Others remain slick from moisture nearly year-round. You notice how often people cough here. Not violently, just constantly. Smoke from fireplaces rarely leaves buildings properly. It lingers in lungs for years. Combined with cold air and crowded sleeping conditions, illness moves quietly through castle life, like weather itself. No one seems surprised by it anymore. In a small chamber near the western tower, Tomas settles onto a straw mattress layered beneath rough blankets. Aldrich sleeps nearby against the wall. Between them, a candle burns weakly inside a shallow iron holder. The flame reveals just enough of the room to make the darkness surrounding it feel deeper. Water drips somewhere beyond the stone. At first, Tomas thinks it is rain outside. Then he realizes the sound is inside the wall itself. You get used to it, Aldrich murmurs without opening his eyes. Tomas says nothing. But sleep comes slowly. Because once the castle quiets, the sounds become stranger. Timbers creak overhead. Wind moves through unseen gaps. Distant footsteps echo briefly through corridors before vanishing. Somewhere far below, a dog begins barking, then suddenly stops. You start understanding why medieval people filled castles with superstition. In places like this, silence never feels empty, only occupied by things you cannot fully identify. Hours pass. The fire in the lower hall weakens. The temperature drops further. By midnight, breath becomes faintly visible in some rooms. And still the castle continues around them. A servant climbs stairs carrying ash buckets. A guard changes watch near the gate tower. Someone somewhere continues coughing into darkness. Morning arrives slowly, not through sunlight, but through grayness. Thin, pale light eventually seeps through narrow window slits cut deep into stone walls. The air feels even colder before dawn fully settles. A bell rings softly across the courtyard. People rise immediately, not because they are rested, only because routine leaves little choice. Aldrich pulls stiff boots onto aching feet. Tomas rubs warmth into his hands before speaking. I dreamed I was outside the walls again. Aldrich nods quietly while fastening his cloak. That usually fades. Neither man speaks after that. Down below, kitchen fires begin again. Smoke drifts upward through the hall. Rain taps lightly against narrow openings high in the stone. And outside the castle walls, the world remains gray and wet and distant. The strange thing is, many people who lived in castles likely stopped imagining anything better after enough time passed. Human beings adapt very quickly to discomfort. Even misery can become routine if repeated long enough. That may be the saddest part of castle life. Not the cold, not the dampness, not even the exhaustion, but the slow way people learn to accept them, as though discomfort itself had become part of the stone. And somewhere deep inside the castle, beneath the smoke-blackened beams and dripping corridors, that feeling has already begun settling quietly into everyone who lives there, even if they no longer notice it yet. By the second week of winter rain, the castle begins to feel smaller. Not physically smaller. The walls remain where they have always been. The towers still rise above the fog. The gates still open each morning with the same heavy groan of timber and iron. But something inside the atmosphere changes. The air grows heavier somehow, more stagnant, as though too many people have spent too many days breathing the same smoke-filled rooms without pause. And after enough time passes inside stone walls, even ordinary sounds begin to wear against the mind. The scrape of benches across the hall floor, the endless dripping water, footsteps in narrow corridors before dawn, doors opening suddenly against cold drafts. Nothing is loud enough to truly disturb the silence. But nothing ever fully allows silence to exist either. You begin noticing how impossible it is to fully rest in places like this. Even during sleep, the castle remains awake around you. A horse kicking against stable wood below. A servant crossing the courtyard in darkness. A distant argument briefly rising near the kitchens before fading again. The body sleeps lightly here, cautiously, as though some part of it remains alert through the night. Outside, rain continues almost without interruption. Water slides constantly down the outer walls. The pathways between buildings become deeper with mud each day. Wooden doors swell from dampness and no longer close properly. In some chambers, blankets never fully dry anymore. They remain faintly cold to the touch, slightly wet at the edges, carrying the smell of mildew and old smoke. Tomas notices it first one evening, while preparing his sleeping place. He presses his hand against the wool blanket and pauses. "It feels worse this year," he says quietly. Aldrich sits nearby, sharpening a small utility knife beside candlelight. "It always feels worse by midwinter. But does it stop?" The older man looks toward the wall for a long moment, then back toward the weak flame. "You stop asking eventually." The answer settles heavily into the room. Not cruel, not bitter, only tired. That seems to happen often inside the castle. People stop asking things, not because they receive answers, but because exhaustion slowly replaces curiosity. In the Great Hall, the atmosphere changes too. At first glance, life appears normal enough. Meals continue. Servants move between tables. The Lord still meets with visitors near the raised platform at the far end of the chamber. But the room feels quieter now. People speak in shorter sentences. Laughter disappears more quickly than before. Even arguments lose energy halfway through. The castle drains emotion slowly. You notice it most clearly near the fire. People gather around warmth instinctively, shoulders close together beneath rough layers of wool and fur. Yet very few actually speak. They simply sit, watching flames, rubbing stiff hands together, breathing smoke-heavy air while waiting for another day to end. And somewhere beneath all of it lies the strange understanding that tomorrow will feel almost identical. One night, a servant collapses near the kitchen entrance. Not dramatically. No sudden scream. No panic. She simply stumbles while carrying a bowl and fails to stand again afterward. For a moment, nobody moves. Then two others quietly lift her beneath the arms and guide her away from the hall. The meal continues almost immediately. Tomas watches them disappear down the corridor. She looked ill. Aldrich tears bread slowly between rough fingers. Most people do by this point in winter. But no one seemed concerned. They are concerned, Aldrich says softly. They are just tired. That answer lingers with Tomas long after the meal ends. Because he begins realizing something uncomfortable. The castle does not only exhaust the body, it dulls reaction itself. People become slower emotionally here. Less surprised. Less expressive. As though constant discomfort leaves no strength for dramatic feeling anymore. Even fear becomes quieter. Late one evening, wind moves violently across the upper towers. The sound slips through cracks in the stone, like distant voices. Torches flicker along the corridor walls. Some extinguish completely. Tomas carries firewood toward the western stairwell, while shadows shift uneasily around him. The staircase narrows sharply as it climbs. The walls feel wet beneath his fingertips. Halfway upward, he pauses. Someone is standing above him in darkness. At first, he sees only the outline. Then a face slowly appears in weak torchlight. An older woman, one of the castle laundresses. She stares downward silently. Neither person speaks for several seconds. Then she finally says, "Storm's changing direction." Her voice sounds almost absent. Tomas glances upward toward the small arrow slit beside the stairs. How can you tell? The walls sound different. Then she continues upward, without another word. The strange thing is, after enough nights inside the castle, that answer almost makes sense. People begin reading the building itself. The sound of rain against stone. The movement of air beneath doors. The tone of footsteps in corridors. The castle becomes less like a home, and more like weather. Something alive around them. Something heavy and difficult to escape. Days continue disappearing into routine. Water hauled from wells. Fires relit. Animals fed. Floor rushes replaced. Clothing dried badly beside smoke. The repetition itself becomes exhausting. You wake cold. You work cold. You eat while cold. Then you sleep in cold rooms before beginning again. And because this life repeats endlessly, small discomforts begin feeling enormous. Wet socks. A draft beneath a doorway. A missing piece of firewood. Tiny problems expand emotionally inside confined spaces. One afternoon, Tomas finds himself standing alone near the outer wall during snowfall. The flakes move slowly through gray air. almost peaceful. Beyond the battlements, the countryside stretches outward beneath winter fog. For a moment, everything becomes strangely quiet. No voices, no coughing, no clatter from kitchens, only wind. And in that silence, Tomas suddenly understands something he has tried avoiding for months. The castle is not protecting them from hardship. The castle itself is the hardship. The walls keep enemies away, yes, but they also trap cold, trap smoke, trap illness, trap exhaustion. People survive inside castles, but few truly live comfortably within them. Below the wall, movement catches his attention. A funeral procession crosses the outer yard quietly through falling snow. No ceremony beyond necessity. 4 men carrying a wrapped body toward the chapel grounds beyond the inner gate. No one stops working as they pass. A stable hand continues shoveling straw nearby. Kitchen boys carry water buckets across the mud. A guard adjusts his cloak against the wind. Life continues around death with almost unsettling calm. Not because people lack emotion, because death feels too common here to interrupt routine for long. That night, the great hall feels colder than before. Even the fire struggles. Smoke hangs low across the ceiling beams, trapped beneath damp air that refuses to rise properly through the vents. People cough more tonight. A child cries briefly near the far tables before being carried outside. Tomas watches shadows shifting along the stone walls. Everything feels dimmer somehow. Not darker, just emotionally faded. Aldrich notices him staring toward the hearth. You should sleep early. I'm not tired. You are. Everyone is. Tomas looks around the hall again. At the pale faces, the hunched shoulders, the slow movements beside firelight. Then quietly asks, does anyone actually like living here? For the first time in days, Aldrich almost laughs. Not fully. Just a faint breath through tired lungs. Liking it has nothing to do with it. The answer settles between them like smoke. And perhaps that is what castle life truly was for many people. Not glorious suffering. Not dramatic survival. Simply endurance. Cold endurance. Quiet endurance. Endurance repeated so long, it eventually became identity. Later that night, Tomas wakes suddenly. For a moment he does not understand why. The room is dark except for faint moonlight pressing through the narrow slit window. Then he hears it. Silence. Not ordinary silence. The castle silence that arrives only during the deepest hours before dawn. No footsteps. No voices. No movement below. Even the wind has stopped. The stillness feels unnatural somehow. Beside him, Aldrich sleeps heavily beneath rough blankets. Water drips faintly somewhere distant inside the walls. Tomas stares upward into darkness. And slowly, he begins listening differently. Not for sounds, but for absence. The missing noises become more unsettling than the noises themselves. You understand now why medieval nights felt psychologically heavy. Darkness was absolute here. No soft electric glow. No distant traffic. No constant reassurance of activity somewhere nearby. Only black corridors. Cold stone. Weak candlelight. And the awareness that beyond the walls stretched miles of empty countryside beneath winter sky. The human mind fills silence with fear very easily, especially when exhausted, especially when cold, especially when trapped inside buildings that never fully feel safe, despite their strength. Eventually, Tomas rises quietly and crosses toward the slit window. Outside, snow covers the courtyard in pale silver light. The castle appears almost beautiful from above, still, silent, ancient. But now he notices something else. No warmth escapes the windows. No golden glow softens the towers. The structure feels emotionally empty somehow, like a machine built only to endure winter after winter, while generations of tired people pass briefly through it. And for the first time since arriving here, Tomas feels afraid of staying. Not because of war, not because of attack, but because he senses what the castle slowly does to people, how it wears away urgency, softens emotion, narrows thought, how people begin accepting discomfort so completely that they stop imagining another way to live. Behind him, Aldrich shifts slightly in sleep. The candle beside the wall finally dies, and the room sinks fully into darkness. Somewhere deep below the castle, water continues dripping steadily through ancient stone, as though the building itself is slowly dissolving from the inside. And perhaps the people living within it are changing just as quietly. Toward the end of winter, the castle grows quieter, not because fewer people live inside it, because everyone has become slower. The season settles into bodies gradually, into joints stiffened by cold mornings, into lungs filled for months with smoke and damp air, into minds worn thin by repetition. Even simple movements begin carrying exhaustion. A servant pauses halfway across the hall to steady herself against a table. A guard climbs tower stairs more carefully than before. Kitchen workers speak less while preparing meals before dawn. No one mentions it openly. But the castle feels tired now. The walls themselves seem tired. Dark moisture stains spread farther across stone corridors. Wooden beams creak more heavily during storms. Some doors no longer shut properly at all. And everywhere, the smell of wet ash lingers. It settles into clothing, into blankets, into hair and skin. You begin imagining that even after leaving a castle, a person would continue carrying its atmosphere for years afterward. The smoke, the cold, the silence, as though the building never fully lets people go. One evening, snow begins falling again just before dusk. Soft at first. Then, steadily. From the battlements, the countryside disappears beneath white fog and drifting flakes. Roads vanish almost immediately. The world beyond the walls fades into emptiness. Inside the hall, people gather closer around the hearth than usual. The flames burn low tonight. Wood supplies have been carefully rationed since midwinter. The heat barely reaches the outer tables anymore. Tomas sits beside Aldrich, hands wrapped around a wooden cup warmed by thin broth. Neither man speaks for some time. The hall feels unusually subdued. No music tonight. No arguments. Only the sound of firewood shifting softly beneath embers. And somewhere near the kitchens, another quiet cough. Tomas watches servants moving slowly through smoke-thick air, then finally asks, "Do you think people remember this place fondly after leaving?" Aldrich studies the fire before answering. Most never leave. The words are gentle, but something about them changes the atmosphere immediately. Because Tomas suddenly realizes how many lives simply disappeared into places like this. Not through tragedy, not through dramatic endings, but through years. Years spent waking before sunrise. Years spent hauling water through cold courtyards. Years spent breathing smoke beneath dim rafters until one winter slowly became another. The castle consumes time quietly. A person enters young, then one day notices gray in their beard beside candlelight. Outside, snow thickens against the narrow windows. The world grows softer beyond the walls, almost peaceful. Yet inside the hall, discomfort remains exactly the same. Cold feet, heavy air, aching backs. That contrast feels strangely cruel somehow. The beauty of winter existing beside the misery of enduring it. Later that night, Tomas walks alone through the inner corridor near the chapel chambers. Most people have already settled into sleep. The castle breathes differently at this hour, more slowly. Torchlight burns lower along the walls. Shadows deepen inside stairwells. The silence between sounds stretches longer now. He passes a narrow window overlooking the courtyard. Snow has covered nearly everything below. Carts, barrels, the muddy pathways. For a moment, the castle appears cleaner than before, almost gentle. But then wind shifts across the stone towers, and Tomas notices how exposed everything still feels. No warmth, no softness, only snow gathering silently across hard surfaces. Further down the corridor sits Brother Edwin, the castle's aging chaplain. He rests alone near a small candle inside a side chamber beside the chapel entrance. Books lie stacked unevenly around him. Most are warped slightly from dampness. The old man looks up as Tomas passes. Can't sleep? Tomas shakes his head faintly. Brother Edwin gestures toward the bench nearby. For a while, neither speaks. The candle flame flickers weakly between them. Finally, the old chaplain says, "When I first arrived here, I thought castles would feel powerful." Tomas glances toward him. But they don't? Brother Edwin smiles faintly. They feel defensive. The answer lingers quietly. Outside the chamber, distant wind hums through unseen cracks in the stone. You spend enough years inside walls like these, the old man continues softly, and eventually you understand something. He pauses briefly. People built castles because they were afraid. Not afraid in the dramatic sense. Not constant terror. Just the quiet medieval understanding that safety was fragile. That winter could kill. That raids could come. That illness could spread through a household before spring arrived. The castle was protection against uncertainty. But protection has a cost. Thick walls keep enemies out. Yet they also keep people enclosed beside their fears for months at a time. Tomas stares toward the candle. Its flame bends gently as cold air slips beneath the doorway. "I used to think life outside would feel dangerous," he admits quietly. Brother Edwin nods. "And now?" Tomas hesitates. "Now this place feels dangerous too." The old man does not answer immediately, because perhaps there is nothing to disagree with. Eventually, Tomas returns toward the sleeping chamber. Along the way, he passes rows of silent doors and narrow alcoves half swallowed by darkness. Somewhere below, someone snores softly behind stone walls. Further away, water drips steadily into unseen puddles. The castle never fully sleeps. It only grows quieter. Inside the chamber, Aldrich remains awake beside fading candlelight. "You were gone a while." Tomas removes his cloak slowly. "Couldn't breathe in here." Aldrich looks toward the ceiling beams blackened by years of smoke. "No one really can." The honesty of the answer feels strangely comforting. No pretending now. No romantic image left to protect. Only truth. The cold, the dampness, the fatigue, and the understanding that medieval castles were never meant to feel humane. They were built to survive, sometimes at the expense of the people inside them. Days continue passing. Snow melts slowly into gray slush across the courtyard. Rain returns again soon afterward. Winter loosens slightly, but never enough. The walls remain cold. Everything remains cold. One morning, Tomas notices Aldrich struggling to rise from bed. The older man hides it well at first, but age and exhaustion have finally begun showing openly now. He presses a hand briefly against the wall for balance. "You all right?" "Just tired." Yet the answer sounds different this time. Not temporary tiredness. The deeper kind. The kind that settles permanently into the body after decades of labor and harsh winters. Throughout the day, Tomas watches him carefully. The slower steps, the pauses between tasks, the quiet effort behind ordinary movement, and suddenly Tomas sees the future waiting inside the castle. Not glory, not honor, only gradual wearing down, like water slowly smoothing stone. That evening, the hall grows dim before supper even begins. Clouds block what little daylight remains. Candles are lit earlier than usual. Faces emerge softly from shadow as people gather around the tables. And for the first time since arriving months ago, Tomas studies everyone differently. The laundress beside the wall rubbing warmth into swollen hands. The stable worker coughing into his sleeve. The kitchen servant staring silently into the hearth while smoke drifts around her face. All of them enduring. Quietly. Constantly. He realizes now that castles were not miserable because of singular dramatic hardships. They were miserable because discomfort never stopped. There was no true rest here. No real warmth. No meaningful privacy. No silence untouched by anxiety. Only survival layered slowly across seasons. Outside, rain begins again against the narrow windows. Soft at first, then steadier. The familiar sound spreads through the hall like memory itself. No one reacts anymore. They simply continue eating. And perhaps that is the final transformation castle life creates. People stop resisting discomfort emotionally. Not because suffering disappears, but because acknowledging it every day would become unbearable. Late that night, Tomas climbs alone to the upper battlements. Rain drifts sideways across the towers beneath dark sky. The countryside beyond remains invisible. Only blackness. The wind feels sharper here. Cleaner too. For the first time in months, the air carries almost no smoke. He breathes deeply. Below him, the castle glows faintly through scattered torchlight and narrow windows. And suddenly it no longer looks powerful at all. Only isolated. A lonely stone structure, surrounded by darkness and weather. A place filled with tired people trying quietly to outlast another winter. The realization settles gently inside him. Not dramatic. Not shocking. Just sad. Because history often remembers castles as symbols of strength. But most who lived inside them probably remembered something else entirely. Cold mornings. Wet walls. Smoke-filled nights. Aching bones. Endless drafts beneath heavy doors. The ordinary misery of enduring medieval life one exhausted day at a time. Rain continues falling across the battlements. Far below, a single torch flickers near the gate before disappearing into darkness again. And standing there alone above the sleeping castle, Tomas understands at last why so many medieval people dreamed of leaving these walls behind. Not to seek adventure. Not to chase greatness. Simply to breathe easier somewhere else. The wind moves softly across the stone. The towers remain motionless against the night. And somewhere deep inside the castle, hidden behind walls blackened by centuries of smoke, countless quiet lives continue fading gently into history. Almost without sound at all.